Hello and welcome to the History Blokes. My name is Conan Elphicke. Chris McCombe, what is your name?
Last I heard it was Chris McCombe.
Excellent. We are your hosts of this exciting new Australian history show. We're going to be focusing on those chapters in Australian history that pretty much everyone has vaguely heard of, but probably doesn't know all that much about, and ought to. That's the key, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely, Conan. And I like to think, a lot of people have these vague recollections of history derived from their childhood, sitting in primary and high school. And let's face it, it's pretty colonial and it's pretty damn boring. However, I think we're going to be lifting the veil in this series.
For example, Chris, the wreck of the Batavia, which is one of my favourite topics of all time. Polio, the invention of penicillin. Do you know there's a smallpox epidemic in 1789 in Sydney that wiped out almost the entire Indigenous population?
Extraordinary.
And various sort of aspects of how the Australian nation came into being. The Citizenship Act, the Flags Act, decimal currency, the start of the ABC, first Anzac Day, first Australia Day. But first, Chris, we're going to be... we should also talk a little bit about our credentials, shouldn't we?
Indeed.
You go first.
Certainly.
You sound eager.
Conan. I read a history book once.
Excellent. Well, you've said more than enough. I also have very few in the way of credentials, but what I can say is that all of the topics that I'll be focusing on, I can't say the same for Chris necessarily, but I conducted painstaking research, Chris, into every single topic. Painstaking research, which I did for someone else, for an organisation. I was in the National Library for days and days, so I can honestly assure you that this isn't off Wikipedia.
You didn't tell me this was going to be an educational experience.
I'm afraid you will learn something, Chris.
I thought we were just going to get together on the microphone and make jokes.
No, there's enough of that going around. People want quality. They want a little bit of fun, but they want quality, don't they? Don't you?
I think this will be fascinating.
Yes. Now, today we're going to be talking about Ronald Ryan. I don't like saying his name, Chris, because I struggle to pronounce my R's. So maybe I should use an alias. I'll just struggle through. So Ronald Ryan, Chris, who was he? You know this.
I believe, Conan, I do know this. He was, in fact, the last person in Australia to be hanged.
When?
1960, mid-60s.
Yeah, close-ish, 67. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So so very good. And I think most people would come up with the same sort of answer. Yes, he was the last person to be hanged in the 60s at some point, but they really know nothing more about him than that. So shall I begin, Chris?
I think you should, please, for sure. But mind you, before you begin, I mean, really, this is, in many ways, a really tragic part of our history because, it's kind of hard to imagine people being hung as late as that.
Hanged, Chris. Hanged.
Hung?
Hanged.
Hung?
Just...
Anyway, as late as that. So, anyway, it's quite an extraordinary part of our history because most people associate that sort of execution kind of something at around the turn of the last century. Not 50 years ago, because that's where we're at.
Interestingly, the first person to be hanged in Australia, so of course executions took place before European settlement, of course. Aboriginal law had its own ways of dealing with miscreants, I guess. Obviously, though, if we're talking about hanging, the first time it took place, Chris, was a month after settlement. And the hapless criminal involved was named Thomas Barrett. He was hanged for stealing food from the common store.
Wow, was he a convict?
Yes, he was. He was a convict. And 1,900 people were executed by hanging between 1788 and Federation in 1901.
Extraordinary, for sure.
So the vast majority of those who have been hanged in Australia were hanged in that period. Only 114 people were hanged between Federation and 1967. Only 15 people were executed between 1950 and 1967. Yeah, things were really on the way out by the time Ronald Ryan committed his crimes in 1965.
And Conan, I do wonder, were there any other types of execution that was initiated by I guess, the Australian government or the government prior to Federation? Or was it always hanged?
My understanding is that it was always hanging,
okay.
Yes. Now, Ryan, this is a Melbourne story, Chris. Ronald Ryan was born in Carlton, 1925. He had an unpleasant childhood, domestic violence, neglect. So he was sort of set up for a life of crime in many respects. Stole a watch when he was 11 and was sent to a school for wayward and neglected boys. But he escaped from this unpleasant place and settled with his mum in New South Wales, worked as a labourer, and then when he was 23, returned to Melbourne and got married to a woman called Dorothy George, and with whom he had 3 daughters. But he became a gambling addict, and he got involved with gangs, with breaking into shops and factories, and eventually was sent down for 8.5 years. He got parole 4 years into his sentence, but soon returned to a life of crime and was sent down again for 8 years. This time, he wasn't prepared to do the time, Chris. So within a year, his wife had divorced him, and he thought, but he missed his daughters, and he wanted to see them. And so he and another prisoner called Peter Walker decided to break out.
They broke out?
They broke out of jail, of Pentridge.
Wow. Isn't that like a maximum security prison? So is there much of a story regarding the breakout?
There's a bit of a story. So it was in the lead up to Christmas, which ironically is when we're recording this. So there was a Christmas party on for the guards. The guards were busy boozing, and I don't know if they're boozing. I imagine they might have had a little tipple. But essentially, there weren't many guards around. So Walker and Ryan then scale a 5-metre wall using blankets tied to a hook at the end. So they sort of abseil, whatever the opposite of abseiling is.
It's like something straight out of a movie, for
sure. Yes, it is. And then they overpower a guard, get access to guns, force the guard, maybe the other way around, then force the guard to open the gate, and then they scuttle out. And at this time, the alarm has been raised, and shots are fired, Chris. And this is crucial in terms of the implications for Ron.
Shots weren't just fired at Ronnie and his mate. He was firing back.
The jury, so to speak, is out on this topic. So there were 11 witnesses during the trial that testified that they saw Ryan shoot dead a guard called Arthur Hodson. But another guard testified that the only shot that he heard fired was by himself. He shot at Ryan over his head because a passerby got in the way. He wasn't able to take a direct shot.
I mean, but the fact of the matter is a guard died during that escape.
Guard died. That's the crucial business. But it's not abundantly clear whether he was accidentally killed or by one of the other guards, or whether indeed it was Walker who fired the shot. But the jury found that Ryan had deliberately shot Hodson, and indeed he was convicted of murder. But we're jumping slightly ahead because both Walker and Ryan were on the run for 17 days, and they got to Sydney. But in the meantime, they robbed a bank. Walker shot someone, killed him.
Wow.
A former associate who was a truck driver. And for some unknown reason, I mean, look, I haven't seen the court transcripts. Maybe there was a good reason for this, but ultimately he wasn't found guilty of murder for that. And eventually they ended up just outside Concord Hospital in Sydney. I don't know why they were still together, because that obviously made it easier the police were tipped off. So really, they should have separated. It wasn't making a lot of sense.
By then I would have shaved my head, fully separated, and taken up a teaching job in Western Australia. So it seems odd.
It does seem a little odd. So yes, so they were arrested and
taken back to Melbourne, extradited.
Yeah, they were extradited to Melbourne. The jury deliberated for 12 days, and on the 30th of March 1966. Walker was convicted on 2 counts of manslaughter, and Ryan was convicted of murder. The judge, whose name was John Stark, that's a cool name, very Marvel, isn't it?
It certainly is.
And he was personally against capital punishment, but it was the law that anyone convicted of murder had to be sentenced to death.
So it was automatic. There was no question about it.
No question about it. So he was. But what had been happening in previous cases was that the cabinet, the Victorian cabinet, because this was always a state matter, the federal government never got involved in this, they simply couldn't. The Victorian cabinet would always overturn that penalty, and it would be like to life. They would commute it to life imprisonment.
And this had happened several times.
Several times, yeah, because the last time someone there had been many convictions of murder and initial sentences to death. But the last time anyone was executed was in 1951, Chris. And that was also the last woman to be executed. So she and 2 accomplices were executed. This time it was different. And it all came down to the Premier of Victoria at the time, who no one has heard of. Do you have any idea who was Premier?
Not a clue at all.
And you call yourself a Victorian.
It's been a long time, to be fair.
His name was Sir Henry Bolt. Heard of him?
Yeah, the name is familiar. It is familiar, only because he's got an unusual name.
So,
he ran 100 metres, didn't he, in about 9.7 seconds? I think that must be him.
Yes, easy to confuse. Anyone called Bolt, you can pretty much assume they're all related. And
they're all sprinters.
They're all the same person. Yeah. So, yes, he was absolutely determined to see Ryan hang.
Political reasons, perhaps.
Presumably, like an election was coming up, not imminently, but I guess he wanted to look strong on law and order. But the odd thing was that there were so many protests from every corner of society, from students, the legal profession, the church, working people, middle-class people, everyone. Opinion polls made it clear there were protests.
Given it had been 16 years since the last hanging as well, people had forgotten this was even part of the process.
Yes.
There's a whole generation that had come through in between where this wasn't part of their lives. That wasn't normal.
Yes, even members of his own party, he was a Liberal, were against it. Members of his own cabinet were against it. But the papers, all of them were against it. So it was really him against Ronald Ryan and his legal team. One of the leading exponents of the anti-capitalist, the anti-capital punishment movement was Barry Jones, of course, who's, now a national treasure, I could go so far as to say. There's a quote from him. He was a leader of the Victorian Anti-Hanging Committee. He said, "I doubt that Ryan had any intention to kill, but I am certain that Bolt did. Ultimately, all executions are political." That's
damning. Yes. Absolutely damning, for sure. And cutting in the way that Barry Jones, is known to.
Yes. So the Philip Oppas, who was Ronald Ryan's barrister, took the matter as far as the Privy Council in the UK, which this was before. Well, at the time, this was the highest court of appeal available to anyone in Australia, but they very rarely.
The Privy Council. Yeah. In London.
Yes. This is a theme we're going to come back to, Chris, over the subsequent episodes, as we garner more and more legions of followers.
That's just incredible. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know that fact at all.
Yes.
I had no idea. And that was the legal circumstance at the time.
Yes, and to be honest with you, I think it was in the 80s, wasn't it, with the Australia Act that changed? Yeah,
yes, I believe so.
But I'm not entirely sure of that. But we will get to that, because I find the Citizenship Act, the Flag Act, all of these things which you just think, well, surely with Federation we basically became independent. We really did not. It was simply that, Federation, and with that very little thought given to our relationship to the UK. Okay, so there was lots of opposition, but as time went on, Ryan's legal options diminished. Despite all the petitions, all the protests, the round-the-clock vigil on the steps of Parliament House, people were taking this seriously. This was the 1960s. People had moved on from capital punishment. And in fact, this was a nationwide issue. It wasn't just centred on Melbourne and Victoria.
I mean, if you look at the 60s in general as well, it was the time of revolution, of change across a whole range of moral, social fronts.
Yeah.
And, I mean, hanging would have been a relic of the past, past that they were moving away from.
Ryan had a biography written about him by a man called Mike Richards, and this is a quote. "There was a new generation of Australians who had come to political maturity and simply believed that hanging was barbaric in our time. They were more confident and assertive about articulating that view." So I guess, yes, he highlights the point that it's not just that people were feeling anti-capital punishment, but they were willing to get out there and do something about it, or at least try. And that, as you said, that was the 60s.
I still find it bizarre that Mr. Bolt, Sir Bolt, I should say,
Sir Henry,
continued to pursue this despite the popular protest. I mean, how is that politically palatable?
Yeah, part of the thing for him was that not long before Ryan's conviction, another guy was found guilty of a genuinely horrendous crime. And he was, of course, sentenced to death, and Bolt was determined to make sure that this guy did hang. But he was found to be mentally unstable. And so for that reason, the High Court, I believe, was able to overturn the conviction.
Correcting past wrongs. Is that what he was trying
Yes,
to do? In his
exactly.
own weird perception.
Yeah. But maybe, he had a bee in his bonnet and he was prepared to throw the upcoming election down the drain. Although, actually, he won the next election more decisively than the previous one. So this did not backfire.
He obviously read the electorate.
Yes, maybe he did. Maybe he recognised that he must have remarkable political instincts. So as I said before, no one had been hanged in Victoria since 1951. But actually, in Western Australia and South Australia, people had been hanged in 1964. As recently as all that. So on the eve of his execution, hundreds of people gathered outside Pentridge, many of them remaining there all night. This is what's kind of sad. Ryan's daughters were not allowed to see him before he was executed. Oh, and nor could they visit his grave after he was buried in an unmarked grave in Pentridge.
It's incredibly cruel. I mean,
they wouldn't.
The logic behind it,
it
just doesn't seem to add up.
No, and I'll get to that in a second. So Ryan was hanged in Pentridge at 8 a.m. on the 3rd of February 1967. Official witnesses say that he went to his death quite calmly. And in fact, there's quite a good quote here from one of the witnesses, a journalist called Brian Morley. He said, "It was terrible. To see a man brought out and put to death while we watched was just the most unearthly and horrible feeling that I've ever had." So yes, as I said, buried in an unmarked grave in Pentridge. His family members could not visit the gravesite, and it was only in 2007 did the Victorian government give permission for his body to be exhumed. And he was buried next to his ex-wife.
I wonder what his ex-wife would think about that.
Yeah, quite.
But regardless, that's a much more appropriate place than some unmarked grave in the prison.
Yeah. What is interesting, though, is that, as a result of his execution, his daughters were bullied at school. And this was quite common. It was often the case that the secondary victims, if you like, of anyone who was executed were the family, who, of course, had lost their loved one in this terrible way, weren't allowed really to visit them beforehand or see the grave. And, in fact, Ryan's daughters were told he belongs to the government now. That's why you can't see the body. They just got this very formal, dismissive...
It's incredibly cruel punishment on his family.
Yeah, and it's quite unnecessary because obviously they weren't involved in anything he did,
Indeed. And, how much more, punishment needs to be meted out to his loved ones.
Oh, yes. And they even had to change their names.
Kids can be incredibly cruel.
Oh, yes.
Incredible.
Shall we take a break, Chris? And
Indeed.
You can tell us about a related topic.
Okay, Conan. Well, we've reached the intermission of our podcast, and we're trying to sort of spice our extended kind of Australian history up with perhaps some interesting facts, things that may be Australian or that may be derived from other parts of the world. In this case, obviously, we're talking about hanging in Australia, and I thought it would be an interesting tidbit to talk about other types of execution, most notably that awful guillotine. I don't think everyone is really familiar with its history. For example, Conan, if I was to ask you, when do you think the guillotine was invented?
I would assume that it would be around the time of the French Revolution.
No, I'd like to say that was the case, but in fact it was invented several hundred years beforehand. And do you know who the guillotine was named after?
Was it a gentleman called Guillotine?
A French physician by the name of Joseph Ignace Guillotine.
So just pronounce that name again for me.
Joseph Ignace Guillotine.
Beautiful.
Anyway, he was an anti-capital advocate in France.
Anti-capital advocate, you say?
Anti-capital punishment advocate in France. And he was seeking a more humane way to execute people. And so he proposed this to the National Assembly. Of course, in 1789, we know what was going on in France around that time.
Bad things for the king.
Indeed. And whilst, of course, the guillotine was named after Joseph Ignace, he didn't actually invent the guillotine. I mean, the actual device or devices very similar to that had been around for a number of centuries. However, the innovation was, they used a specific type of blade, and they actually had stocks set into the instrument to stop people moving around, set it apart from the others, and in my mind made it a much more industrial method. Beheading had been the domain of the upper class, which is quite remarkable given it seems so very brutal. And of course, this wasn't very much fun, for the upper class, clearly, because...
but it was worse for the working class, wasn't it?
Oh, it was certainly worse for the working class, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the reason they decided to move from the old-fashioned method, which was literally just having your head placed on a block and having an axeman take a couple of swings, to the guillotine, is because they kind of realised that taking someone's head off was actually more of an art than a science.
Yes.
And the axeman often missed.
Yeah.
So 2, 3, 4 blows before it takes your head off. That's not a pretty way to meet your maker.
The only problem I have with the guillotine, it sounds humane, but after the head leaves the body, it then falls into a basket, doesn't it? And experiments have been conducted, particularly in the 20th century when the French were still doing this, to determine whether consciousness still resided in the severed head. I'm going to use this phrase again, Chris. The jury is still out, I believe, on whether or not, or for how long people remained conscious. But the problem that I would have is that your head falls into the basket. I don't think there's a cushion there. I think it would actually perhaps the worst part would be headbutting the bottom of the basket. I don't think people give that enough thought. Yeah.
Because the bruising itself would be terrible.
I would be BYO cushion or pillow, or I'd have someone catch it.
You could dress them up. You could nominate the person to catch your head.
Someone with good hand-eye coordination and a strong stomach.
Now, whilst obviously having your head lopped off was the realm of the upper class, the common people faced a whole variety of awful executions, far worse than that, and far more painful and far more torturous, really. Like commoners, for example, could face being broken on the wheel, so essentially strapped to this kind of wheel contraption and having all the bones, or as many bones as they could muster, broken, essentially, before they... Yeah. I presume they must have lopped your head off at the end of that process.
Yeah, I don't really know. Yeah, or they might have just been left there.
Yeah, I think.
Perhaps who's responsible for the guillotine section should research that before starting to talk about it.
I'll certainly be looking into that next time. So anyway, back to the guillotine.
So who invented it if it wasn't this man, Guillotine?
The guillotine was actually designed by another physician, Dr. Antoine Louis and Tobias Schmidt, a German engineer and a harpsichord maker, the Mercedes and Benz of the guillotine, really.
Right.
And they began their work 3 years after Joseph Ignace managed to secure agreement by the Assembly.
Yeah, so just in time for the Reign of Terror.
Yeah, it's actually a terrible story and it made it easy to kill thousands of people by essentially industrializing the process, including, of course, Louis the 16th and Mary Antoinette.
Yeah, and in fact, it was Louis, I believe, who sanctioned the use of the guillotine. So he was quite keen on this being used as a replacement for manual beheading.
Dare I say, Conan?
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Say the word.
Dare I say, Conan, he was hoisted by his own petard.
Yes. It's certainly ironic. But, if he hadn't sanctioned it, he still would have been executed. It's just in a much more pleasant way. So he did himself a service. So as you were saying, the blade is a bit different to that used previously. It's angled, as is the present-day guillotine, which was just used for cutting paper or something. Laws of physics determine that it's just, the weight is just concentrated at the point where the blade first makes contact.
Indeed. And then you could argue that whilst it isn't necessarily a more humane way of killing people, it was certainly a much quicker, cleaner way of killing people.
Well, that's humane, isn't
it? It was certainly more certain. Well, I guess you could argue that.
But how would you like to be executed?
Well, I think, the whole Blackadder item, where would you like me to stand? Perhaps behind this wall, in front of the firing squad.
Yeah.
But, Conan, back on the guillotine, when do you think it was last used?
Well, I am aware that the French continued to use it into the 20th century, but I don't know the year, and I look forward to finding out.
Indeed. Well, it might surprise many listeners that France was still executing people with the guillotine up until 1977.
Wow.
I know. I mean,
So that's our lifetime, Chris.
it's recent history.
Yeah.
It's recent history. And it was outlawed 4 years after that.
Yeah, I mean, there ultimately is no supremely humane way of killing anyone, and by way of execution. And it's a very good thing that in this country and in most sane countries, it has been eliminated.
Indeed.
Oh, Chris, shall we return?
I think we'll return to the main story.
So as I said before, Sir Henry Bolt, less than 3 months after the hanging, was returned with an increased majority. But in 1975, it was abolished in Victoria. And it's certainly the case that the whole thing with Ronald Ryan contributed to that decision. So the abolition took place not under Bolt, but under his successor, whose name was Sir Rupert Hamer. What's this thing? I don't know if it's just a Victorian. You're a Victorian, Chris. Are you fond of giving knighthoods to your premiers?
Do seem to be a whole lot of knighthoods running around in Victoria. I think
I don't approve. I
think the last Sir Premier must have been him, surely.
Well, yeah, good question. That's another thing to get back to us on.
I think we'll have to do that in a following episode.
How many premiers of Victoria were knights? And how does that compare to other states? Everyone wants to know that. Okay, do you want to take a stab at guessing when the other states abolished capital punishment?
Well, how things usually work in Australia, you tend to get one state leading the charge and then this kind of wave across the country because precedent is set. So look, I would expect probably follow within maybe a decade of Victoria.
Yes, that's relatively close. So yes, 1975 in Victoria. But it had actually been abolished in Tasmania in 1968, a year after Ryan was executed. South Australia in 76. Western Australia in 84. 1984. New South Wales did it in 2 stages, in 1955 and 1985. Do not ask me what constituted those 2 stages. But here's the surprising thing. When do you think Queensland abolished capital punishment?
Oh my God. Well, I've spent some time in Queensland and I have very fond memories there. So I presume 2010?
That's the way I was inclining you to go, wasn't it? But actually, Chris, it was 1922. They were by far the first state.
Wow, that is absolutely fantastic.
I don't think there's a single mind listening to this podcast that has not been blown by that information.
That is an incredible fact when you think about it. Yeah, particularly given conservative governments and so on.
2010 is reasonable.
I was being slightly cheeky.
Yes, you were. Sure, but you could sort of you could see Bjelke Peterson being willing to basically die rather than allow it to be abolished. Yes, and also the territories, Northern Territory and the ACT, it was banned in 1973. But of course, it was banned for them by the federal government.
Yeah, of course. But the 20s in Queensland, I mean, that's a fantastic fact. It really is, and good on them.
Yes.
Absolutely good on them, for sure.
Yeah, we put Queensland down a lot, don't we?
Particularly the Victorians. I think so. I think, they deserve to cop some stick, I think, on this front.
Why do the Victorians put them down so?
Well, Queensland, it's like, 20 years behind and so on.
But we all know that.
The big cities and the little states, but the big cities and the like.
So, and in addition, it's now impossible really for the laws to back. I mean, no state is going to reintroduce capital punishment, not unless some Donald Trump populist nutjob gets into power. No. But even if they do, there was a federal law that was passed in 2010 that makes it at least very difficult, as far as I know.
A federal law passed in 2010.
Yes,
to effectively ban executions.
Yes, in Australia. So I don't quite know how that works in relation to state law, but my understanding is that it does supersede state law and is in keeping with various human rights treaties we've signed. But of course, opinion does remain somewhat divided, but by no means 50-50. It's really almost always been the case that Australian public opinion since 1967 has put on the side of abolishing capital punishment, even when we have the Port Arthur massacre and the Bali bombing and things like that. People recognise that it is barbaric. It's final. It can't. If evidence emerges later, that's very difficult to unkill the person. You very rudely didn't ask me how I want to be executed.
Oh, how would you like to be executed?
By elephant. So the Indians were keen on this because I thought, look, I'll just do some quick research on bizarre execution methods over the years, and within 5 minutes I had to stop. It was just because, not surprisingly, it's pretty gruesome. Human ingenuity in this area, particularly if you're not interested in making it humane, but quite the opposite.
And for the most part, that was the case.
Yes. But yes, I think it was. So the Indians were quite keen on, at some point, on you being crushed by elephants, so an elephant would simply stand on you.
Stomp you.
Yeah.
That sounds like a terrible way to go. Why would you choose such a thing?
Well, it's exotic.
It is exotic. I do like that.
But I suppose the night before, if people ask, how are you going to be executed? So, crushed by elephant. They say, cool.
There is a coolness factor to
Yeah,
that.
it's got a certain panache.
Yeah, I still like my on the other side of the wall post the firing squad.
No, that's true. But the thing with the elephant too, I mean, if it's done right, I imagine it'll be pretty quick.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so. But if it's done very poorly, one leg at a time, you're in all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it might depend on the training. Yeah. So I think we're done with making light of capital punishment, but I certainly don't want to make light of the execution of Ronald Ryan. Yes, because the unfortunate thing is that there is no real certainty around whether or not he committed murder.
He could have been an innocent man, at least as in regards to that specific murder.
Yeah, and it could have been the case that years down the track into his life sentence, evidence did arise that demonstrated he didn't fire the shot that killed Hodson.
We've seen that. That time and again. Absolutely. 20 years down the track, during imprisonment, new evidence emerges and people are released. I mean, it's a travesty, and that's one of the fatal flaws. Sorry about the pun in capital punishment, because there is no going back.
No. So that's I'm sure was a contributory factor to why people were so vehemently against his execution and to subsequent executions, because it's not as if he was a serial killer. He wasn't. He hadn't committed a massacre. So there was a degree of sympathy for him that would not have existed for, say, someone like Martin Bryant. So that was certainly a factor. But fundamentally, this was reflective of the age, the 60s in Australia, and I feel very satisfied now, Chris. I feel that the three people listening to this can pass the rest of their lives at least with a smattering of knowledge about this interesting incident.
Well, look, I've actually learnt a lot, Conan, and I thank you for your diligent research as part of pulling together this episode. And look, and I think it's a fascinating, if not morbid, obviously, part of our history. And look, I'm looking forward to learning more as we sort of work through the next few episodes.
Yes, I'm excited for you. I'm excited for me. Mostly, I'm excited for the listener.
We appreciate you being there.
Yes. Thanks, Mum. Okay, until next time, goodbye for now.
See you all next week.